Hello, I'm Oliver and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. As a lot of you will know, I had planned to get this Björk guide out much earlier in the year, but then she announced her new record Utopia would be coming out on the 24th of November, which is 5 days from the day I released this guide. So I thought it would make more sense to save this guide so we could reflect on her groundbreaking work before tucking in to her new offering. I will be including a review of Utopia in my November roundup video, so if you're watching this video anytime after early December, all you got to do is click on the link in the top right hand corner, or you've got to just follow the URL that I've pinned at the top of the comments section, which will take you there. So this in effect will be a full guide of her work. It's just going to be a couple of weeks before Utopia is included. So Björk, an artist that defies simplified description, well and truly. Her modes of expression flow from dark to explosive, intensely passionate, painfully sad, infectiously confident. What's so incredible about Björk is her ability to write and construct music that's refined, in some ways esoteric, but in no way exclusive or obtuse for the sake of it. Her music was and still is particularly forward-thinking, and in a number of different ways. You've got in terms of its structures, its convergence of styles, her very unique vocal delivery. We're talking trip-hop, elements of classical, IDM, electronic music, an edge of industrial in some places. Her music exists in its own world entirely, a vibrant world that's full of wonder, fear, danger, beauty. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my hyperbolic ramblings at the beginning of this guide. I always have to do it. I think if you've never listened to Björk before, you needed to hear that. And if you have heard Björk's music before, then you'll probably be nodding your head in agreement to some of the stuff I've just said. Oh, and before you start typing in the comment section, you're saying her name wrong.
Hello, my name is Björk.
So there, from the woman herself. Apparently she doesn't mind if you pronounce it Bjork, but the proper pronunciation of her name is Björk. Rhymes with jerk. Okay, right, let's start at the obvious place, shall we? Björk, full name Björk Guðmundsdóttir, was born in Iceland in 1965. In many ways a child prodigy, she started tuition in practical music at the age of just 6 on flute and piano, and it really can't be stressed how important this early musical development was on her life. She was already being noticed at this point for her enthusiasm and the early blossoming of talent. In 1976, a recording of her singing the Tina Charles track, I Love to Love, was played on Icelandic radio, and through this she got in touch with the Falcon label, or the Falcon label got in touch with her, and she ended up with a bloody record contract at the age of 11. And this is technically Björk's first solo record. I mean, she doesn't even herself include it as canon these days. I think she said in interviews previously that she doesn't feel it particularly reflects her. She was only 11 years old, so she didn't have that much artistic creativity going into this record. It's mostly a collection of covers. It's not particularly anything special, other than the fact that she's 11 years old and on a record, which in itself is an impressive feat. But mostly it's a collection of covers sung in Icelandic, ranging from the Beatles to Melanie Safka to Stevie Wonder. But come on, how many 11-year-olds have a record contract? I mean, let's put this in perspective. The most indicative track on this release is a track called Musatigin, which I'm definitely saying incorrectly. I will put it up on the screen. It's a recorded tribute to the Icelandic painter Jóhannes Kjarval, and that's written and recorded by Björk herself. And even though, yes, it's on a recorder and that might give some of you horrendous flashbacks to school and whatnot, I think that it's a very early indicator to the talent that Björk had as a child, which will blossom in her later years. Apparently, with the money made from the record, Björk bought herself a piano and began to compose her own personal compositions in earnest, and so begins her legacy. In her teens and early adulthood, she was involved with a lot of different bands in the Icelandic music scene, and it shows how untethered she was to convention at the time. She was just willing to get stuck into any and all kinds of music that was being expressed by bands in Iceland at the time. You've got bands called Spit and Snot, for example, that were like a punk group. You have Tapi Tikaras, which I think translates roughly to Cork in the Bitch's Ass or Arse, which was an amalgam of punk, folk and avant-garde styles. There was also Exodus, which was a jazz fusion group. So at the time she was finishing up music school and obviously taking all of these different collaborations with different musicians and assimilating these different musical ideas and expressions into her own songwriting and kind of working out what sort of music she wanted to make. Her ambition, a very important word, is going to hit you as you listen through to this discography. She's not afraid to put herself out there in earnest. She attempts bold and brave things as an artist. She really did at the beginning, and she still does now. There are countless other collaborations and projects that Björk worked on in the early 80s. Too many to mention here, really. I think otherwise we'll be going off on too much of a tangent. But, you know, we've got to look into the ones that really matter. And the first real one that matters before we get to Björk's solo work is the Sugar Cubes. Very much the band that put Iceland on the map musically. The Sugar Cubes was comprised of Björk and then various other veteran members of the Icelandic music scene, people that she would have met during her early collaborations. So people like Bragi Olafsson on bass, you have Einar Orn Benediktsson on trumpet and vocals alongside Björk. You also have Eldon, who was the guitarist that Björk got together with and had a child with called Sindri in 1986. Their debut record, Life's Too Good, released in 1988, is actually a really fun record. It has lashings of Talking Heads style avant-garde post-punk, bubblegummy pop melodies, and also lashings of alternative rock at some points. It's a record that genuinely sounds as if everybody involved wanted to capture the vibrancy of life and an excitement, and all those things encompass Life's Too Good. Guitarist Thor Eldon said this in an interview in 1988. The professional rock music, what it lacks is vitality, the lust for life. We have that in abundance. We are in harmony with life itself. The album paved the way for the band's success. It included the cracking single Birthday, a single that did very well overseas, particularly well in the UK. And in many ways, it's the first track to truly showcase Björk's imposing yet hypnotic vocal presence. I love the track Blue Eyed Pop because it has this contagious stomp about it. And what's great is at the point of the track where Björk's vocals come in and they just completely eclipse Orn's own vocal delivery. It's just so much more intense and passionate, and she has a magnetic quality that really gets delivered on this track. Her whoops and growls, her breathy tone, those ear-splitting high notes that she hits. In 1989 and 92, there were two further LPs released by the Sugar Cubes. You had Here Today, Tomorrow Next Week and Stick Around for Joy. Personally, I don't think either of them really hit the highs that Life's Too Good hit. There's some interesting stuff in there, but really if you want to hear what Björk sounded like before she goes into her solo work, listen to Life's Too Good. Björk decided she wanted to go off in her own direction, away from the kind of music that the Sugar Cubes were making. So she moved to London, started making some friends in the music scene in London, and what happens next? In June of 1993, Björk's first proper solo album, appropriately titled Debut, is released. Debut is quite the stylistic switch up from the music of the Sugar Cubes, which was altogether more of a hard-edged rock post-punk kind of sound, even if it was on the more eclectic side of things. In an interview in 2015, Björk talked about why she felt she needed to move away from the sound the Sugar Cubes were making and go off in her own direction. I was in bands from when I was 15. I preferred being in a group, but I think what happened to me, the music in the band I was in, wasn't my taste. I love the people in it. We still text each other all the time. We all run this label in Iceland called Bad Taste, and they still like my best mates. But as a music nerd, I just had to follow my heart, and my heart was those beats that were happening in England. It's an interesting admittance. Perhaps if you listen back to some of the work on Life's Too Good, some of the other Sugar Cubes work, you can hear Björk's wonderful vocal parts are yearning to branch out in a different direction. I think you can hear there's a slight tension there where she just wants to push and really explore different musical ideas that away from the kind of expressional boundaries that the music of the Sugar Cubes had her boxed into. So here she is in London with a handful of tracks already written, ready for her debut. A lot of debut is comprised of tracks that she wrote whilst playing in bands such as Cocoon and the Sugar Cubes, so they were ideas that had been gestating for a little while. It's clear the second debut starts up that Björk is following her heart, as she stated in that quote. Opening track Human Behaviour clatters along with this jangly strut, and it would sound like a conventional dance track if not for the instrumentation being ghost snares and timpani drums. Already in the first track alone, we can hear this convergence of styles happening. You've got electronic sensibility fusing with this magisterial classicism. Second track, Crying, switches this up, driving the track with a pounding bass drum beat, revealing Björk's interest in electronic expression even further than the first track did, and it's a fierce proponent of her music that will follow on from this record. Her incredible vocals stretch across this wonky piano melody. It has this crowd-pleasing 90s dance feel to it. You can hear that influence in there, but again, it's offset primarily by her voice, but also these eerie synth drones that occasionally interject all the ethereal tuned percussive bell melody that's going on this track. Nelly Hooper, who was an original member of the Wild Bunch before they became Massive Attack, produced Debut alongside Björk, and he's an important name to keep in mind because Björk's name has become synonymous with the UK trip-hop scene especially her mid-90s output. So keep his name in mind and keep that relationship between Björk and trip-hop in mind as well. There are already moments that feel trip-hoppy on this record. I mean, particularly the bass line of Venus as a Boy, that really springs to mind. There are some brilliant moments scattered across this record, and you have the melancholy of Like Someone to Love, which is a jazz cover complete with swooning strings and harp. The sultry club stylings of One Day. The starkness of the anchor song in this track, Björk's voice fills this space beautifully. It's almost alone, but it's accompanied by this horn section. It's just Björk and the horn section, and there's a kind of call and response going on there. The starkness of that track is wonderful. This really did shake things up. Björk went on to receive critical acclaim for this record, and she won some various awards, really getting noticed by different music scenes around the world. And it's good. It really is. In many other artists' catalogues, this would probably be seen as a pinnacle, but this is Björk we're talking about, so things are about to get even better. Let's jump to 1995. Björk, now becoming a household name due to her success of debut and also her work with the Sugar Cubes previously, releases her second album, Post, an album that seems to take the creativity and the joy from debut and inject it with a confidence. That's the real increase of quality here, is the confidence of her work, a true belief in her artistry. Post is a wonderful, diverse collage. Just look at the jump in vibrancy of the album art alone. You know, the simplicity of debut is very much an anomaly in her catalogue. And Björk has talked in the past about the importance of colours in her music making, so both in the musicality but also in the visual representation, so the album art and the cover and the visuals that come along with the music, something that becomes more and more important as we progress through her discography. The first thing I always know, maybe it's a musician thing, I always know the colours pretty early, and it's like solving a murder mystery. This is the perfect collision of colours to represent this record. More than any other Björk record, this one seems to embody that idea of diaspora, so moving from one's homeland and culture and understanding a new culture, which is then bringing different ideas together, different cultural expressions together. And much of the music on Post is an embodiment of the trip-hop, club and techno culture of 90s Britain, but also it has that alluring eclecticism that makes Björk's work so unique and exciting. This time the production work branched out, so Nelly Hooper's still working on some of these tracks with Björk, but also trip-hop musician Tricky, who was a big proponent of the Bristol trip-hop scene. He came and worked on 2 songs in Joy and Headphones with Björk. The two of them actually had a very brief relationship, which was very blown out in the media from what I can gather. In addition, Graham Massey co-wrote the tracks Army of Me and The Modern Things even before debut had been produced. So he came back to work on Post to produce these tracks to fit in with the sound of Post as a record. Post explodes right from the off with Army of Me. It's one of Björk's best tracks, I would say. It has this fuzzed out industrial bass line which thumps alongside this trip-hop beat, and the chorus has a descending scratching sound that Björk made with a coin against a bass string. Jumping straight into second track Hyper Ballad reveals the diverse nature of Post. It's a wonderful ability that it has to bound between these different ideas. Another single release alongside Army of Me, Hyper Ballad, is one of my favourite songs of all time. This is such a brilliant 1-2 way of opening a record. It's widely considered one of Björk's best tracks, and the lyrics reveal the poeticism in which Björk often focuses on relationships as a theme of her work. I go through all this before you wake up, so I can feel happier to be safe up here with you. This is Björk talking about the Hyper Ballad lyrics. I guess that song is about when you're in a relationship and it's going really well and you're really happy and maybe you've given up parts of yourself. To fall in love and be in a relationship for a long time is like giving a lot of parts of you away because the relationship becomes more important than you as individuals. It's a bit of a tricky balance. I think everyone in a relationship needs to know not to forget themselves. Again, this fascination with the British dance and electronic scene is embodied in the techno rhythms of this track that come in about halfway through. But it's offset by the arresting string parts that just give that feeling of splendour to the tracks. Again, she's just offsetting those conventions. Oh, It's So Quiet is a big band cover of the track made famous by Betty Hutton. And again, it's a very different sound to anything we've heard so far on Post. It's another stellar example of Björk's unparalleled vocal ability. She utterly commands this track. Really, you have to listen to it. Her dramatic, breathy delivery is interjecting with these feral shrieks alongside blaring horns. It's such a great track. I wish I could talk about every track here because there really isn't a single dud. A track like Cover Me is fascinating for its background of its recording. So she moved to the Bahamas halfway through the production of Post and recorded the vocals of this track in a bat-infested cave. You can hear the drips coming off the stalagmites. You can hear this natural reverb around her voice. Also important to note at this point that her music video work was a huge part of her popularity and her success as well, gaining a lot of attention for her captivating, unique music videos that were coming alongside these brilliant singles. She's working with people like Spike Jonze, a video like Isabel that was inspired by the work of George Méliès. So there's a real focus and creative talent to the music video work as much as there is the music as well. And again, that brings in the fact that the visual is an important component of her artistry, just as much as the musical is in some ways. Brilliant record, and at this point you couldn't really escape Björk. She was becoming an icon. In 1996, Telegram was released, which is a remix album of the material from Post. Not an essential release by any means, but it's nice to hear different versions of tracks like Hyper Ballad, I Miss You, etc. So personal life-wise, things got a little bit crazy now for Björk. Some of you may have heard of Ricardo Lopez. He was a stalker who was completely obsessed with Björk, and when he found out about a relationship Björk was having with the musician Goldie, he became angry, furious in fact, and attempted to send an acid bomb to her London home. Luckily it was intercepted by police before it reached her home, but about 4 days after the incident, Ricardo Lopez was found in his apartment. He'd killed himself. Obviously shook up by this. I mean, you would be, wouldn't you? Björk made the decision to move away from that limelight and the spotlight she was getting in London, relocating to Spain. Up to this point, she'd been working on her follow-up to Post, but she continued much of that work in Spain. I give you 1997's Homogenic. Now, this is about as close to perfect as a record gets for me. By no means am I being hyperbolic. This is one of the best records of all time. Another incredible album cover, completely iconic now, of course, really the true emergence of Björk's influence on the world of fashion, as well as the world of music. The cover was produced and shot by the famous Alexander McQueen, and yet again the imagery is particularly indicative of the music on Homogenic, much like the way the colours of Post really mirrored the sound. The regal grandeur of the costume, it represents the solemn, moving instrumentation and Björk's ever evocative voice. You've got the crystallized flowers that surround her, that are the icy strings that pervade all the tracks here. In producing the visuals, Björk told McQueen that this record was created by a warrior who fights, but doesn't fight with weapons, fights with love. And this is very much the theme that McQueen took to creating the visuals of this record, and this is the concept that they went with. And I think clearly you can see that the Lopez debacle had transformed Björk's artistic focus in no small way. In her own words, Homogenic was very much about a person who is put into an impossible situation under a lot of pressure. I don't even know where to begin with this bold, emotionally charged masterpiece. I should also mention that Mark Bell of LFO worked on the majority of the production of this record alongside Björk, and it just continues her down the path of musical discovery via electronic music. Opening track Hunterdon, let's start there. A cold electronic opening with this synthetic bass and sample beats flickering across the scape. It has a very military feel to it, and this is coupled with these esoteric layered synths and swooping strings, which are very much a core part of Homogenic's sound. The Patriotic Strings here, that's what they've been referred to in the past because they have an Icelandic feel to them. They are here throughout the entire record, and they're coupled with this often austere electronic instrumentation, which creates, funnily enough, a very homogenized record. And Björk said that her approach to this record was very much that. She wanted to create a record that had only one flavour, in her own words, and that's an obvious switch up from the diverse sound collage that Post was. You know, she is creating something here that has a singular concept, and it really does deliver on every level. The collision of organic and electronic really reflects Björk's approach to making this album. Again, in her words, she wanted to make it feel like a rough volcano covered in moss. Second track, Yoga, is stunning. It's foregrounded with these stately string parts again, as Björk reflects on missing her home of Iceland and her state of mind around the time of making this music. Emotional landscapes, they puzzle me. The riddle gets solved, and you push me up to this state of emergency. How beautiful to be. State of emergency is where I want to be. The beats were actually collected from volcano sounds by Björk and the sound engineer, and the clattering just rings out alongside the gorgeous melodies on this track, but also on the rest of the album too. And the track is intimate, but it has a propulsive energy to it. A danger almost. Again, the danger of an exploding volcano. It's here in the music, in the instrumentation, in the delivery. Her use of percussion on tracks like Unravel, Bachelorette and Alarm Call have called some people to dub Homogenic as a trip-hop masterpiece. And whilst I think elements of trip-hop are clearly in the instrumentation of this music, the music can't be easily boxed into that trip-hop category, I don't think. The punchy 3/4 beat of All Neon Like grounds the track, and once again Björk utterly mesmerizes with her otherworldly vocal melodies, especially that pivotal line, "Don't get angry with yourself." Just the way it's delivered, it's just bliss. Penultimate track, Pluto, is nightmarish. Björk talking about this track. It is about being plastered, that need to destroy everything so you can start over again. No extra baggage. It's about death and birth. Her use of semitones and stuttering, distorted electronic sounds coupled with her own clipping vocal really does make this thing terrifying. Final track, All Is Love, is, in her own words, like the birds coming out after a thunderstorm. Gorgeous massaging sub-bass converges with graceful strings as Björk repeats, "All is full of love. All is full of love." Really is like the sun coming out after a very tumultuous thunderstorm, and it works so well as a follow-up track and a finale after Pluto. Worth noting that the single release of this track is very different to what ended up on the album. So on the album, you've got this minimalist version produced by Howie B, but Björk produced the single version herself, which has a trip-hop beat over the top of it, which gives it a very different sound. Also, you should check out the music video directed by Chris Cunningham. Chris Cunningham, known for creating many groundbreaking and transgressive music videos for people like Aphex Twin as well. And there's this futuristic scape with these two female robots connecting and sharing a kiss. And it's a landmark music video in many ways. And I think this whole post-humanism concept of the visuals of the music video feels connected to the themes and ideas so prescient in Homogenic, the convergence of electronic or synthetic and organic emotion. Wow, what a record. Now I want to very briefly talk about Dancer in the Dark, which was the polarizing film Björk made alongside Lars von Trier, the Danish director. Björk had always said she had no interest in being an actor in any way, but upon reading the script for Dancer in the Dark, she became compelled to think, well, if I'm ever going to do a performance on film, this should be the one that I do. The story of a blind woman named Selma is the focal point of this disturbing musical. The music is all written by Björk herself and compiled into the Selma Songs album, which was also released in 2000. The dark subversion of musical cliche is really apparent in the track Kvalder, where industrial electronic percussion clatters alongside these whooping horn sections, and they're almost parodically musical sections. They seem to almost identify with the ideas and themes of musicals, but she subverts that idea, and it really works. Of course, the track I've Seen It All has become well known because it also features Tom York on vocals, the first time these two collaborate together. And they're two musicians who respect each other enormously. I know Tom said many times that Björk's one of his favourite artists, and the way that she communicates her art is so impressive. It's also really worth checking out Radiohead's cover of Unravel from Homogenic, actually. They did it on a webcast once. I'll put the link in the description if you want to check that out. During the premiere of the film Dancer in the Dark, and this is one of the most famous or infamous points of Björk's career, certainly in the media anyway. She attended Cannes, which is where the premiere was happening, and she wore that very famous swan dress, which for some reason got a really vitriolic response from a lot of people. I'm not sure why. Looking back, it seems absolutely ridiculous that everyone was so... some people were angry about it. I mean, it wasn't a real swan. I think you all needed to chill out a little bit. At this premiere, she was awarded Best Actress for her performance, which is, you know, impressive in itself. This is the first time she's properly appeared on film, in a feature-length film, as the main actress, and she's already managed to garner acclaim from that. Again, just shows that when she focuses on something in the creative sphere, she gives it her all. Sadly, as we've all found out in the last month, Björk was actually a victim of abuse at the hands of director Lars von Trier at the time of filming, and she did release a statement about the treatment she received on this film, which I will again link in the description if you'd like to read that yourself. Everybody together now? Fuck you, Lars von Trier, you disgusting subhuman. Anyway, the following year, we get the follow-up to 97's Homogenic Vespertine. It's an unreal follow-up because it's another masterpiece in so many ways, and it's far away a repeat from the kind of work that Björk was doing on Homogenic. Things get even more intimate here, both musically and thematically. This is Björk on the approach of the record. I sort of started to create that sound world in 97, started collecting those microbeats, and was very interested in things like celestas and harps and music boxes. All sounds that are short and percussive and sweet. And then with these beats, again, it was all the clicking, insecty noises. Those microbeats are these gorgeous little flourishes that flutter around the tranquil soundscapes of Vespertine, with Björk taking a much softer approach to her vocal work. That breathy tone is increased tenfold. At times, she's actually whispering. There's a sexual intimacy to this record, with much of the lyricism and themes inspired by Björk's new relationship with artist Matthew Barney. There has always been an eroticism to Björk's works, especially her lyricism, since the early days, but never in any traditional sense. Again, she defies a convention. She stops things from feeling conventional and obvious. And the intimacy here on Vespertine is stunning. It's probably one of my favourite examples of that kind of intimacy being harnessed within music. Opening track Hidden Place introduces this domestic, intimate record that Björk is aiming for. Deep bass textures and percussive timbres swirl around one another. You have this choir accompaniment backing Björk's very private lyrics. Through the warmthest chord of care, your love was sent to me. I'm not sure what to do with it, or where to put it. I'm so close to tears, and so close to simply calling you up, and simply suggesting we go to that hidden place. I love her own description to the meaning behind these lyrics. Hidden Place is sort of about how two people can create a paradise just by uniting. You've got an emotional location that's mutual, and it's unbreakable. And obviously it's make-believe, so you could argue that it doesn't exist because it's invisible, but of course it does. So many of these microbeats were recorded by her around the home, just using simple household items or sounds that she hears. But she actually also approached the electronic group Matmos to help her add a few more sounds, like keep layering up these sounds. And they use things like packs of cards and crushed ice to develop even more of these sort of clattering, clicky sort of textures that are throughout the album. I also want to note at this point though that in the past Björk has noted a frustration that she's had with music critics and people in the industry that seem to want to give more credit to the people that she works with than her herself, especially for the sounds that she's created. So when she created Vespertine, much of the writing around it credited Matmos for providing basically all of the percussion and all of those sort of intimate domestic sounds and the microbeats, but that's far from the truth, because actually Björk created most of this herself. Matmos only came in right at the very end just to add a few little finishing touches. They weren't the core designers of the sound of this record in any way. Her collaborators are helpers or enablers, if anything, and she deserves all the credit that she can get when it comes to creating the music that she creates. She is not a pop artist who comes in and sings over the top of a track created by someone else. You know, she develops these tracks herself. She creates this music herself. So give her the bloody recognition she deserves, please. The track Cocoon is literally a cocoon as you listen to it. It's a gorgeous sexual lullaby that crackles and fizzes in your ears as you listen to it. It's Not Up to You contains one of my favourite Björk vocal melodies ever, backed by the plucking of violins and harp tones. Lovely, lovely track. Much of Vespertine was written and produced in a loft in New York alongside harpist Zena Parkins, which reveals why the harp is such an integral part of this beguiling and beautiful piece of work. Everything here is perfect. Sun in My Mouth, Aurora, pagan poetry. You know, that moment in pagan poetry where Björk cries out, I love him, it over and over again is just one of the most heart-wrenching moments of her musical output. Nothing here disappoints, and I could go on about Vespertine for a lot longer, but we've still got 4 more records to go, so I'm going to move on. In 2002, Björk gave birth to her and Matthew Barney's daughter, Isadora, And 2 years later, in August of 2004, she releases her follow-up to Vespertine titled Medulla. I'll count this as her 5th LP, only because Selma Songs was a soundtrack, and also her work as an 11-year-old child can't really be counted. So this Medulla is technically her 5th LP. Being the daring musician that she is, Medulla marks another artistic pivot in her songwriting and musical output. I give you her a cappella album. Almost the entirety of Medulla is constructed with the human voice, and this approach mirrors the title of the record and Björk's thematic approach. Medulla means marrow in Latin, or that could be bone marrow or a marrow that grows in the ground. She wanted to explore the basis of the human experience, kind of break everything down to our specific biological component, going back to our point of origin and making something that's about love, but also there's something that's quite political, which really brings in some of the socio-political context of the time that she was making and writing Medulla. I wasn't aware of that when I was recording, but I guess Triumph of a Heart and Pleasure Is All Mine are about love. The rest of the songs are about ancestry and trying to go back to the core of civilization before religion and terrorism and George Bush. Living in New York post 9/11, I was repulsed by the racism and patriotism that swept through America, and the way I survived it was by encouraging my friends to switch off their TVs and stereos and just sing together. One of us would do the beat, another the bass line, and so on. It sounds naff, but it felt very liberating. I don't know about you, but for the most part, if someone says a cappella album to me, I politely decline. The idea of beatboxes and people singing bass lines sounds awful to me, and it rarely succeeds. Except with Medulla, it does succeed. Somehow. Björk worked with people on this record like Mike Patton, throat singer Tanya Takak, beatboxers like Dokaka and Razel, an Inuit choir, and it comes together really impressively. Just to alleviate your fears of beatboxing, because I'm sure most of us have those fears, listen to Razel on the track Who Is It? Because with his mouth he manages to create this glitched out IDM beat on this track, which has ultra clarity, yet you can clearly hear it comes from the human voice, which in this environment and within this context of the album works really well. The moments where conventional instrumentation are included serve as a light embellishment more than anything else. It's a framing to the human voices that command this record. So there's bass synthesizer that lightly grounds the track of Who Is It? There's piano on Ancestors, and it's quite light. You have an electronic program bubbling going on Mouth's Cradle. But yeah, these moments just lift things a little bit. They don't take over at all. The human voice is still very much the focal point of this record. And there's something quite operatic about much of the vocal work on this record. Takak's throat singing, for example, on Mouth's Cradle, it sounds historic and grand. And the idea of tapping back into history, I think, genuinely comes into play here. The track Vokuro, the title translates to vigil, and it's an old Icelandic lullaby, and Björk uses the lyrics from an Icelandic poem that are all connected to the pastoral landscape, and it's just another indicator to her constant connection to nature and environment. And the Icelandic choir backing this track creates a majestic yet delicate piece of music, and it feels like an ode to Iceland. It feels like an ode to nature, and it's really lovely. It's a really lovely construction of that through the human voices. Oceania is a great track. It's full of these choral vocal swoops that recall violin glissandos, and Björk's lyrics again connecting to earth and human relationships. And this track was actually written for the Olympic ceremony in 2004, and she performed the track there. Basically, the Olympics people asked me to do a kind of Ebony and Ivory or We Are the World type song. Those are smashing tunes and all that, but I thought maybe there's another angle to this. I think because the song is all about how the ocean doesn't see boundaries between countries and thinks everyone is the same. A gorgeous track for this line alone. You show me continents, I see islands. You count the centuries, I blink my eyes. An album that takes longer to connect with, I think, but it's beguiling and evocative, and another showcase of Björk's unparalleled talent. In 2005, Björk worked on another film, this time an experimental art film directed by her partner Matthew Barney, called Drawing Restraint 9. I haven't actually seen this film, but I have, of course, listened to the soundtrack. The accompanying soundtrack is a very interesting listen. It's some very wispy and enchanting textures that get created on this. If you listen to the paper-thin bath or the skittering track Storm. Like I say, I haven't seen the film. If any of you have seen the film, I'd be really keen to see what people's thoughts are on it, so make sure you comment down below. We're jumping to 2007 now for Björk's next full-length LP titled Volta. Hard to believe this album turned 10 this year. The album still feels really new to me. This marks another stylistic switch up for Björk, coming off the back of the 3 records that are quite intimate, very serious in their subject matter for the most part. She decided to go for a different approach and harken back to the lightness of records like Debut and Post. But not lightness in terms of the energy of the music, in fact pretty much the opposite. So Björk approached Timbaland to help her produce some of the tracks on Volta. Timbaland isn't perhaps the sort of person you'd expect Björk to approach working with, especially after travelling this exploration of all her previous records with me. Music that strays away far from mainstream pop convention. It seems like a strange fit on the surface, and Björk herself expressed a slight concern going into starting production on some of these tracks with him. He actually only ended up producing a couple of tracks in the end, but that approach of vigorous rhythms and dynamics follows through on the entirety of the album. Thankfully, this record is not Björk's sudden foray into the world of glittering mainstream pop. I think that this is a release with some good moments on it. It's not the work of genius that albums like Homogenic and Vespertine are, but there's certainly things to talk about on here that are good. I think the full-bodied approach that Björk was trying to take with the sound of this record really comes across and contains some great moments of strange and wonderful sounds. Those punchy tribal rhythms are the point where Björk and Timbaland's musical interests overlapped, so that's what ended up being focused on in their time together in the studio, and you can hear that clearly on the 4th track, Innocence, which was produced by Timbaland, and the percussion smacks you in the face as these interjecting keyboard synths abrasively collide with Björk's vocals. In contrast, the opening Earth Intruders has a more organic tribal percussion backbone, and once again it just brings together the sounds of organic and electronic processed sounds, brings it all together on this album. Though much has been said about this record being her most accessible, and much was said about that prior to the release, I don't really think it is that accessible particularly. What strikes me most when listening to this record is Björk is not afraid of taking her time to let a track unfurl. She assumes the audience's intelligence and their acceptance of being swept up into a track and going on a journey with it. And I think that's a great thing. Assuming the audience's intelligence is something that she does throughout her discography, and I think that's really important. She's not dumbing down her musical expression in any way. And I think that is very clear in a track like Vertebrae by Vertebrae. A distant horn section pulsates on the beat as this fizzing, whispery drum sample obfuscates the track in some ways, and it's just another beguiling moment in Björk's musical output. Declare Independence is one of her hardest tracks, recalling a track like Pluto from Homogenic. An industrial, distorted synthesizer slices through the track and it's backed up with this pounding, cracking bass drum beat. Björk's signature dynamics make this track wholeheartedly, really throwing herself into these politicized lyrics dedicated to Greenland and the Faroe Islands. Declare independence, don't let them do that to you. Start your own currency, make your own stamp, protect your language. This track was actually written a few years previous to Volta by Björk's frequent collaborator Mark Bell, but both felt that it really fitted in the context of this album. The one issue I have with this album is it feels like it lacks focus in some areas, which in turn makes Volta feel a little bit bloated. And that's not a criticism that I could level towards any of Björk's other records. And there's still some good stuff in here, but I would say personally that this is her weakest LP release. After Volta, there are a number of collaborations that Björk did, including an EP with Dirty Projectors called Mount Wittenberg Orca, which I definitely think is worth a listen. She was also awarded the Polar Music Prize, joining legendary musicians like Dizzy Gillespie, Joni Mitchell, Elton John, Steve Reich, Bruce Springsteen. Then, in 2011, Björk releases her 7th full-length LP, Biophilia. A very ambitious release for a number of different reasons. First off, this was a very socio-politically conscious record. Björk wrote this during the financial crisis, which Iceland had a big part in, and as such he wanted to explore the inextricable links between nature and humanity and technology, and what musicology has to offer to humans and the human experience. With this pedagogical approach to music in mind, Björk released this record in July 2011 as an iPad album, the first of its kind, and this is the first the world had heard of the tracks on Biophilia, and the idea was to be able to rejig the musical components yourself, so there's an element of play and creativity and an untethered expression that defines the tracks on this album. For a while, Björk even trialled these sessions at the Manchester International Festival where children will come and learn about music and interact with the album via the iPad, and they get to help to create these sounds. So there's that pedagogical approach once again, and I love this as a concept. Björk really just takes this concept and really runs with it and throws herself into it fully. And you might not like the music on Biophilia, but you cannot deny her vision of this record. If you get the opportunity, I highly recommend you checking out the app release. It's still available on the App Store. I think you can get it on your phone now as well. And it will really give you an idea of what Björk was aiming for with this unconventional release. The conventional album release came out in October of 2011, and the versions are actually quite different. So the music on the app is quite different to the final product, and apparently Björk felt that many of the app versions, whilst working within the creative context of the app, didn't really have enough depth for a conventional release. So additional components, musical components, were added, and the production was beefed up a little bit. At this stage, Biophilia is probably recognised as Björk's weakest release, but I like this record. It has this unique hypnotic intangibility to the music, and occasionally it skims the kind of intimacy that is used on an album like Vespertine, for example. I do think that Volta is Björk's weakest release, and I think that there is just something really individual and strange about the tracks on this album, these 10 songs that she puts on there. If this is the first time you're entering into Björk's discography, don't dismiss this record. Another key part of this release is the instruments that were created for the album specifically. Here's where her unique process of creating this record once again brings in that convergence of the organic and the electronic. It's still here in her creative musical output. So this robotic Gamelan Celeste hybrid was actually built solely for the sound on this record, and it plays a big part in the sound of the album. This extraterrestrial, otherworldly, ringing bronze percussion. I want to say celestial, but it's a Celeste, so that's where that comes from. But it is like a celestial, heavenly sort of sound. And on the lead single, Crystalline, you can really hear that being utilised to its fullest. There were these wooden pendulums that were created to play bass lines. At one point, there was plans for this 30-foot pendulum creation that would play 30 notes, and it would be on stage at her performances, but apparently it was too much effort to make that, so in the end it was a more simple structure. But again, it's just another instrument that was built to create the sounds on this album. The track Thunderbolt uses the sound of an electrical discharge from a Tesla coil for the bass line. I mean, that's seriously adventurous. I think this is where many people would argue that the music doesn't live up to the undeniably out there production techniques. I would disagree. It's also a record that playfully toys with time signatures throughout, creating an even more evocative and shifting set of tracks. You've got 17/8 being used on Moon and Crystalline, 7/4 and 6/4 being used on Hollow, and the lack of any pulse at all on Dark Matter gives it that untethered quality once again, and it makes this record flow gorgeously. It just swoons around Björk. Don't sleep on this. That'll be my opinion. Check it out and try and ignore some of the criticism that's labelled against it and see what you think for yourself, because I think if you step back and listen to this in context of the rest of her discography, this is a really impressive release. Worth briefly mentioning the Bastards remix album, so a little bit like Telegram after Post was released. This is a remix album, but this time you've got remixes from people like Death Grips, Omar Souleyman, These New Puritans, and in June 2014 Björk took that relationship with Death Grips a little bit further and recorded vocals with them in the studio, which they ended up using on the first half of their 2014 The Powers That Be album. Now we reach the final period of Björk's career before new album Utopia is released. During this time, Björk's life was upside down. Alongside having issues with vocal nodules, which meant she had to actually undergo surgery on her throat during the Biophilia tour, she also had a nasty split with her partner, Matthew Barney, and Matthew Barney being the subject of so much of that intimate lyricism on an album like Vespertine. I think it's safe to say that Björk was utterly heartbroken by this. This raw heartbreak is painfully captured on Volnicura, released in 2015. Working with two future legends of electronic music, Arca and the Haxan Cloak, both who I am a big fan of, Björk creates one of the most brutally honest and emotionally quivering albums I've listened to, and her more reserved vocal style on this album just breaks me every time I listen to it. If you have access to the sleeve notes of Volnicura, you'll be able to see that the first 6 tracks of the record are subtitled. They signpost the time in which the track was written, so either before or after the point where the relationship with Matthew Barney fully broke down. This just increases how uncomfortably intimate the tracks on this record are, and obviously in a very different way to the intimacy of something like Vespertine, which was a celebration of love, and this is kind of not a celebration, it's a declaration of pain because of the infliction of love or losing the love of someone. And that discomfort in the lyricism on opening track Stone Milker, when you see the subtitle 9 months before, you get that palpable sense that Björk feels the connection with that person is slipping away. Some have said that the strings and electronic soundscapes in Vulnicura are very similar to that of Homogenic, and you can definitely see the similarities there. Both use those components musically, but they're manifested in a very different way on Vulnicura. Homogenic, it has that dramatic theatricality to it, and Vulnicura has none of that, and I think if it did, it would lose that sense of dejection that Vulnicura so clearly harnesses. Third track, History of Touches, subtitled 3 months before, takes that sexual intimacy that's so prevalent in Björk's songwriting, but this time it's drenched in sadness. The production on this is sparse, these heavily treated choir and string melodies that are digitized and glitching, and they're all spaced away from Björk's foregrounded vocals. Every single fuck we had together is in a wondrous time lapse with us here at this moment. The History of Touches. The centerpiece of the record, Black Lake, is 10 minutes of racking grief. The strings provide the fluttering melodies as this sub-bass ripples underneath Björk's vocals. My heart is an enormous lake, black with potion. I am blind, drowning in this ocean. This is 2 months after the split with Barney, and it's a painful experience listening to it. I can't even imagine what kind of emotion Björk must have been pooling into this track as she made it. As the record enters its final stretches, a ray of light begins to appear on tracks like Atom Dance, for example, but it's not in a way that undermines the bleakness of the first 6 tracks of the record. It's Björk showing that she is able to overcome this. She's overcome worse than this, and she will overcome this as well. And it's just another beautiful little intimate moment that's conveyed in the music that she's making. A really accomplished record, and to my mind it just keeps getting better and better with age. And that takes us up right until now. In 4 days' time from the day that I released this video, Björk is preparing to release her altogether apparently more uplifting follow-up to Vulnicura, titled Utopia. I mean, it sounds more uplifting, the title itself. I mean, if you're watching this a couple of weeks after I made it, as I said, all you've got to do is click on the link in the top right-hand corner, or go down to the pinned comment at the top of the comment section, and you can continue my analysis of Björk's work with my review of Utopia. And one final quote from the icon herself. I'd always been 100% certain that I was an atheist, and then slowly, as I came to realise as I got a little bit older and maturer, that perhaps I had a religion, and it was nature. She's been described before as the primordial voice of Iceland, but I think it goes deeper than that. She's the primordial voice of all of us. And that is my guide. I've had an absolute blast making this. I always enjoy making these guides. Björk is an artist that has a special place in my heart. I know this guide is by no means exhaustive, and there's so many more things I could have talked about, but I didn't want to make this video 2-3 hours long. Hopefully you've been inspired by this guide to go and listen to all of these albums if you haven't heard them before, and go and explore things like her B-sides and her collaborations and all of the other wonderful things she's done as an artist, because she really is so special. And please share the hell out of this guide. Introduce Björk to new people, because she deserves to be listened to by everybody. So please, chuck this guide out to friends and family of people that you think might benefit from having a little bit more Björk in their lives. Love you all. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.